The war has been going on for close to 3 years now. Plausibly over 1 million people have been wounded or killed so far. Yet both sides keep throwing more manpower into the grinder. Indeed, both past wars and examples in this war showed that manpower advantage is crucial to winning battles. But the fact that Russia has a much bigger population may not be its ace card, as internal politics also have a say in it all. This video will cover that aspect as well. It will look into the mobilization potential of both sides. It will explore political problems that might impact further troop generation. It will analyze demographics and available population. And finally, it will estimate current monthly losses, so a final net figure of positive or negative troop influx can be assessed. Answering the burning question, will Russia or Ukraine run out of fresh troops first? Is Ukraine struggling with troop numbers? It's a pressing question that's been making waves in Western governments, but perhaps not as prominently in the media. That's where today's sponsor Ground News comes in. Ground News cuts through the media noise by aggregating stories from thousands of sources worldwide. It gives me the tools to compare perspectives, track narratives, and uncover biases, all from one easy-to-use app and website. Take the recent discussions about the UK and France considering troop deployments to Ukraine. Over 50 sources have covered the story, but here's where Ground News stands out. Their tools show that left-leaning outlets cover this story less often. For instance, French Le Monde frames the move as a response to Trump's potential return, while the Financial Times suggests European troops might actually secure a Trump-backed peace deal. Another powerful feature is the ownership data tool. Ownership often shapes bias, and Ground News makes it easy to see who owns each outlet reporting on a story. They also include factuality ratings from 3 different independent fact-checking organizations, so you can quickly compare the credibility of the reporting. And then there's the blind spot feed. This feature highlights stories with lopsided coverage, the ones that people on one side of the political spectrum might ignore. For example, Ground News points out how stories like Israel's destruction of Syrian weapons caches since Assad's fall often go unreported by right-leaning outlets. With the blind spot feed, you won't miss these critical perspectives. Now here's the best part. Binkov viewers get an exclusive deal. Ground News is offering 50% off their Vantage plan, which I personally use to unlock all the app's advanced features. Already subscribed? You can even gift Ground News to someone else at the same discounted rate. To take advantage of this offer, click the link in the video description, go to ground.news/Binkov, or simply scan the QR code on your screen. With Ground News, it's easy to stay informed. Try it out. Let's see how many fresh troops each side is currently generating per month. In July, the New York Times reported Ukraine was drafting 30,000 troops per month in May and June, compared to just 10,000 to 15,000 per month in January and February. This increase followed a new mobilization law that streamlined the conscription process, introduced penalties for failing to register, and lowered the draft age by 2 years. By mid-July, nearly 5 million men under 60 were registered, though only a small part will be drafted due to workforce, financial, health, or other constraints. This October, news emerged of plans to draft 160,000 more troops over 3 months, suggesting a potential mobilization rate of 50,000 per month. That plan means 20,000 more per month over the May and June mobilization figures. However, Roman Kostenko, secretary of Ukraine's Parliamentary Defense Committee, noted mobilization rates fell in September 2024 after initial gains in spring. While earlier goals aimed for 200,000 recruits, Kostenko now believes the previously called for figure of 500,000 troops might be necessary, with the 160,000 plan possibly being part of that push. Nonetheless, sustaining high recruitment rates seems difficult. Mobilization has fluctuated, peaking in surges before tapering off. Future long-term conscription rates may fall further, first to 25,000 per month and eventually again normalizing around 10,000 per month. Ukraine-leaning military analyst Michael Kaufman echoed those challenges. During his trip to Ukraine, he also observed declining mobilization figures in late summer and expressed doubts about easily resolving Ukraine's mobilization issues. But what about Russia? It has a different set of problems when it comes to troop generation. While Ukraine is forcefully pushing people in the military and paying much lower sums to them, Russian leadership is too afraid to do a similar forced mass mobilization. It fears mass internal unrest if it tries it. Putin did a limited mobilization in September 2022 and has since managed to avoid doing it again. But continuously increasing the pay for new contract soldiers can only go so far. There's always going to be a limited number of people lured by big money, enough so that they risk their life. Furthermore, Russia is not doing that great financially either. Most recently, Russia cut payments to soldiers wounded in the war. A new system introduced multiple injury categories and lowered payouts for most of them. The payment redistribution is expected to result in savings for the Ministry of Defense, and saving on your injured troops could be a sign that Moscow is slowly running out of cash. The Kremlin claimed 190,000 people signed military contracts in the first 6 months of 2024. That works out to little over 30,000 per month. Latest figures aren't available as the Kremlin simply stopped reporting the number of new contracts since July, which could in itself be a sign of the numbers trailing off further. Only other assessment came from a late June New York Times article, which cited a US official claiming Russia was recruiting 25 to 30,000 troops per month, which sort of corroborated Kremlin's figures of the time. Michael Kaufman, however, recently suggested Russia is still not losing more troops than it generates per month. Interestingly, there is a Russian federal budget draft for 2025 throughout 2027, which includes future signing-on bonuses for new soldiers, totaling 90 billion rubles for 3 years. At the current rate of 400,000 rubles per bonus, the funds are enough for 225,000 new contract troops during those 3 years, or just 6,000 troops per month. Of course, that bonus might be decreased in the future, with Russia maybe counting more on volunteers who are not motivated by money. Adding those, it's plausible that without a forced mobilization, long-term Russian capability to generate troops, including true volunteers and lured work for hire troops, will dip to 10 to 15,000 troops per month by the end of 2025. But it has to be pointed out that's just guesswork. Troop losses are a more stretchy category than troop generation. They're also not constant. Russia may choose to attack more or less over time, raising or lowering their monthly losses. As mentioned, US and British officials suggest that Russia is having 25 to 30,000 people wounded or dead per month. That's roughly 1-to-1 with the influx of new troops, but some of the wounded will go back to battle. Both Ukraine and Russia publish numbers of enemy troops neutralized, but those we won't consider. Those are basically propaganda on both sides. Western military sources are a bit better, at times suggesting far higher casualties for Ukraine than Ukraine admits. But those two we will use just as crutches. Two primary casualty sources we will use are Mediazona and UA losses. Both count obituaries, burial reports, social media posts about deaths, inheritance claims, and so on, and interpolate greater figures from there. While Mediazona is fairly open about who does its work, UA losses is not. But Mediazona and Medusa publications themselves checked out UA losses project's work and concluded it's reliable. All casualty sources are gonna be bad and incomplete, but UA losses looks like the least bad one out there. Talking about Russian casualties, Mediazona said that September and October 2024 death reports were around 140 to 150 per day. That would add up to little over 4,000 per month. Of course, Mediazona itself says additional deaths are a given, hidden from their sources. They added that in 2023, average daily deaths were under 100, equating to at most 3,000 per month. Mediazona estimates that their collected data on dead Russian troops covers between 45 and 65% of actual total deaths. With that taken into account, monthly deaths may be reaching 8,000. Mediazona has to date found evidence for 82,000 dead Russian troops. Adding the modifiers mentioned above, Mediazona suggests that anywhere from 126 to 182,000 Russian troops have actually died to date, to mid-December specifically. That's not all, as initial Donbas republics' deaths were not included. Adding those, Mediazona suggests the total for Russia may be anywhere from 152 to 205,000 dead troops. But what about Ukrainian figures? UA Losses Project suggests they found evidence for some 60,000 Ukrainian troops' deaths by mid-November. Their weekly deaths graph suggests Ukraine's greatest losses were in the summer of 2023, during its offensive, where over 400 deaths weekly were common, or close to 2,000 per month. Lately, 250 to 300 deaths per week seem more common, or 1,200 per month. Last few weeks should still be waiting for additional data, so the total mid-December tally may approach 63,000 dead. But UA losses may not be fully comparable to Mediazona's data. They offer only numbers with little interpretation, and Ukrainian and Russian reports may not be of the same standard. Lacking better methodology, we will use the same modifiers for Ukraine that Mediazona used for Russia. Applying the 55% to 120% modifier, like Mediazona used, we can ultimately get anywhere from 97 to 140,000 dead Ukrainian troops. Now, we can run those figures against whatever US and British intelligence claims were over time. An October New York Times article suggested unnamed US officials said that by the end of September 2024, Russia had 115,000 killed and 500,000 more wounded, and that Ukraine had 57,000 killed and 250,000 more wounded. A September Wall Street Journal article cited different numbers. It said a confidential Ukrainian source had 80,000 Ukrainians died and 400,000 more were wounded, presumably by the end of August. If one would add 3 more months of casualties, something like 87,000 might be expected. Less than the above projection we made, sure, but not that much less actually. So the total tally might be roughly 110,000 dead Ukrainians, give or take a few tens of thousands, and roughly 170,000 dead Russians, again give or take a few tens of thousands. The figures here include both Mediazona, UA losses, and Western military estimates in the overall range. Of course, many of the wounded will not see fighting again. World War II statistics suggest half of the wounded are injured gravely enough so they don't return to fight. Modern stats are not available, but if World War II ones are applied to the figures given, and if the mentioned US officials' multiplier of 4.3 wounded to 1 killed are applied, then one gets the following. Neutralized troops, meaning those killed and those injured so gravely that they can't return to fight, would favor Ukraine. Roughly 350,000 of those suffered by Ukraine, and roughly 520,000 of those suffered by Russia, again give or take by 100,000. Those are staggering figures on both sides. They suggest Russia may have suffered 50% greater losses than Ukraine, give or take. But one has to remember that Russia has a bigger population. The Russian Statistics Office said that as of the end of 2023, Russia with Crimea had 146 million residents. Adding some people that remained in Ukrainian territories under Russian control, Russia's total population in practice should be close to 150 million. On the other hand, Ukraine's current population within the territory Ukraine controls is smaller. The IMF did an analysis concluding that as of start of 2024, Ukraine had 31 million residents in the area under its control. That's because many others fled as refugees. Now, people that left Ukraine were largely women and elderly, but there were some men. A 2023 study telling Ukrainian refugees in Italy suggested that some 8% of overall refugees were men aged 19 to 64. Also, little under 3% of total refugees were boys 15 to 18 years old, some of which are already old enough to fight if the mobilization law changes. Applying those percentages to the overall number of refugees, Ukraine lost access to some 540,000 men aged 19 to 64, and on top of that 180,000 boys aged 15 to 18, meaning potential future troops, or basically 45,000 boys maturing per year. Of course, in reality, only a part of all those figures could be mobilized. But let's look at Ukraine's population pyramid. It's of course only estimated based on pre-war figures, and refugees are not included in it. Some 180,000 men turned 25 this year. Remember, 25 is the current mobilization age in Ukraine. Next 3 years will see slightly fewer men reaching 25, around 170,000 per year. Due to the boys that became refugees, the bulge visible in the 10 to 15-year-old bracket will essentially be unavailable to Ukraine, and Ukraine will be stuck at 180,000 or so boys maturing per year. Remember, no country can mobilize 100% of people, as workers are also needed, so actual mobilized fresh young men are likely gonna number well under 180,000. Over a long enough period, those percentages will keep dropping. Generally, in world wars, belligerents could not mobilize much over 20% of male population. Initial percentages tend to be higher, but as the war drags on, overall percentages drop. For example, in World War I, Britain mobilized roughly 24% of men aged 15 to 49 during the first year and a half of the war. In today's society, more averse to war service, more needy of workers, and already fed up with war after almost 3 years, it's unlikely Ukraine could be able to mobilize even 20% of men. Direct comparison with Russia right now can't be made because Russia is still not mobilizing its general population. As we said before, Putin's big fear is, if he tries doing that, the people would uprise and he might lose power. Russian army might have to stop their military ops, and the whole war would have been in vain. So the fact that Russia does have many more boys available per year doesn't really help it right now. If Russia started mobilizing boys when they turn 18 years old, it could count on, in theory, roughly 800,000 new men per year for some years to come, but in reality only a fraction of those per year might serve. Russian population advantage over Ukraine is roughly 4.9 to 1. If Ukraine manages to mobilize half of their annual boys coming of age cohort spread over 12 months, that would give it some 8,000 more troops per month. That's fewer than Ukraine is generating now and fewer than it was generating even before the low points before this last mobilization push. Evidently, older men are still making up the bigger part of Ukraine's monthly troop additions, but those are a finite resource, and those additions won't last forever. Now, as we said, mass mobilization is not a sure thing, especially for Russia, which is why a much more likely event if Russia runs out of volunteers is another limited mobilization, like in September of 2022. If Russia somehow manages to mobilize an equivalent of just 10% of its boys that have turned 18 each year, it will have some 7,000 fresh troops per month. Who knows if that's sustainable for Russia's political situation, but in a long enough fight, Russia could match Ukraine's figures with much less internal political and societal friction. But even for Ukraine, doubling down on continued mass mobilization is politically not feasible. The morale is pretty low as it is. People simply don't want to be dragged away and thrown into trenches. That may be in part why Zelensky is so unwilling to mobilize men younger than 25, or to start mobilizing women, for example. While Russia may be boxed in by their limited choices, it's not like Ukraine doesn't have its own set of political and societal limitations. Then there are deserters. It's a very hard category to quantify. Mediazona reported little over 5,000 people facing charges in Russian courts for 2023 desertions, and another 5,000 in the first 7 months of 2024. Russian desertions are definitely on the rise, and complete figures may be even higher, but Ukraine seems even worse off. Unlike Russians, who face losing large monetary compensation, Ukrainians have far less to lose by deserting. Almost 100,000 Ukrainians have been charged with desertion, according to the General Prosecutor's Office. 2024 looks likely to end with 70,000 desertion cases. It's plausible many of those have returned to service, but still, Desertions are likely having a massive impact on troop numbers. In 2024, Ukraine may be losing as many troops to desertions as it is to enemy action. In the end, Russia simply has more room to generate troops. Yes, it seems to be suffering 50% greater casualties, but those aren't high enough to hurt Russia more than Ukraine, given Russian potential. Russia is also achieving successes on the front lines and is pressuring Ukraine in return for those casualties. If Russia stopped pressing forward, it's likely its casualties would not be any higher than Ukrainian ones, and if Ukraine started attacking, it's likely Ukrainian casualties would go up. So in the short term, Ukraine seems set to somewhat approach Russian troop levels. It will both generate more troops and suffer fewer losses. But Ukraine has less room to keep up that troop generation engine. So the medium-term projection has both Russia and Ukraine working with similar total troop levels for a while. That alone may not be enough to completely stop Russian progress, as Russia has advantages in other areas like military hardware. And a few more years into the future, Ukraine will plausibly be generating fewer troops and their overall troop levels will start dropping behind Russian ones once again. Without a huge influx of Western weapons or additional troops, long-term future projection for Ukraine doesn't look promising. Eventually, fresh troops on the ground will matter. Ukraine is trying to inflict as many casualties on Russia as possible, but Russia is also dictating its casualty rates and by attacking more slowly could lower them. Russian mobilization potential is a huge unknown and potentially a life extender for Ukraine if Russia never manages another mobilization. Still, it's possible that if Ukraine doesn't get additional troops from outside Ukraine, in a year or two it may not be able to keep fighting Russia. All that means that the actual end of the war might come even sooner, as people give up even before the ship sinks completely. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.